Dear brothers and sisters, today we celebrate the feast of the holy apostle and martyr, Saint Barnabas. If you have been following this online Mass and paying close attention to the past readings, especially from the Acts of the Apostles, you should be familiar to this great figure of the Church by now. But let me tell you a little bit more about what I believe to be the greatest contribution of this man that would significantly change the course of the history of Christianity. His faith in the conversion of Saul, or Paul of Tarsus, who, along with St. Peter, is now regarded as a great pillar of the church. Peter, the apostle to the Jews, and Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles. Well, today's first reading tells us Barnabas was sent by the mother church in Jerusalem to Antioch in Syria in order to help in getting the young church better organized. And St. Luke tells us that it was at Antioch where the disciples of Jesus were first called Christians. You know, in the olden days, it was a negative term, a pejorative term. Christians meant a fanatical sect of Jews who worshipped a criminal as their Lord and Savior. Don't forget, most of them were Jews who were later expelled from the synagogues for proclaiming that their teacher or rabbi, the carpenter from Nazareth who was crucified by the Romans, resurrected from the dead, and that he was not only the Messiah. Messiah is from Hebrew Mashiach. He was the Messiah or the Christ. That's the translation of Mashiach in Greek, the Christos. He was not only the Christ that the Jews had been waiting for. He was the Son of God. Well, the Christians at Antioch were rapidly growing in numbers, and they needed some help. And Barnabas knew where to get it from, namely, from the very man who used to persecute them, from the man who had caused many of them to be arrested and executed. Of course, we also know, through the narration of St. Luke, that this man, Saul, was eventually converted through a direct intervention of the risen Jesus. You remember that time when he was on his way to Damascus? Well, St. Luke also tells us that after Paul was converted, it was Barnabas who endorsed Saul to the apostles in Jerusalem. But you know, Saul was too controversial. He was causing too much negative reaction. You know what they did? They sent him back home, sent him to his hometown in Tarsus. I think they wanted, to end it quietly that way. I have a feeling that the Jerusalem community did not know what to do with Saul or how to deal with him. They have not yet forgotten how this man used to persecute them. And now, he would just suddenly come out claiming that he also had become a follower of Jesus? Of course, they would remain cautious with him. In their minds, I am sure, they were suspecting that he could have been planted by the Sanhedrin to spy on them. He could be an undercover agent of the Romans. He could be posing as a convert so that he could penetrate the communities of the early Christians that were operating underground. In short, it was too much of a risk to trust this man. And so you see, there was Saul, or Paul of Tarsus, a new convert, already a changed man, called by Jesus himself. but he remained unwelcome, unaccepted by the early Christians in Jerusalem. What other choice did he have than to return to his home in Tarsus? Maybe his own fellow Pharisees did not even trust him anymore. In short, he found himself totally isolated and ostracized. Now, in this kind of a situation, who would think of paying Paul a visit in his hometown in Tarsus? Ta-da! Barnabas. Our Barnabas, whom we're celebrating today. It is Barnabas who would bring Saul personally to Antioch. It is Barnabas who would do everything in order to heal the wounds and to get Paul reconciled with the community that he once persecuted. I imagine Barnabas taking very seriously what Jesus says in the gospel, that if you are at odds with your brother, you better leave the gift and go and first be reconciled with him. I wonder what acts of penance Saul had taken upon himself in order to convince the Christians that he was for real, that he was sincere, that he was no longer their enemy, but their brother and their fellow disciple in Jesus. You know, if I were to find a parallel for Paul in our times, perhaps you can imagine a former death squad leader leaving his job, and because he is being haunted by his conscience, he goes out of his way to visit the families of his former EJK victims and seek their forgiveness. Imagine a man like this even volunteering to serve them. Well, we have given credit to Barnabas for this great achievement. Not only does he succeed in reconciling Saul with the Christians at Antioch, he even taps the help of Saul to be part of the mission team that is about to be deployed by the church at Antioch to Asia Minor. In Saul or Paul, Barnabas had discovered a prodigy, a potential prophet, a teacher, a fellow apostle, the one who would open the doors of the early church to the Gentiles, and that includes all of us. I hope you now see how deeply indebted we are to this great man, Barnabas. He also died as a martyr. Aside from being an apostle, he's a martyr. The point is, and please take note of this, the church never closes its doors to anyone, not even to its worst enemies. Why? Because we stubbornly believe that nobody is beyond redemption. Call us idealistic, call us naive, call us what you may. But you will never know how God can still change the hearts of people, even the hardest of hearts. How He can strike the proud down and make them eat the dust, like He did with St. Paul. How He can blind them so that later they could see a little better. How He can effect a 180-degree turn in the lives of people like Paul, who from being a persecutor would become the biggest propagator of the Christian faith. A few days ago, I was just talking to a religious priest who was a former drug addict. He shared to me his story, how he got rehabilitated through the intervention of people who truly cared for him. Now, he is very much involved in the ministry of rehabilitating addicts and opening the doors of the church to homeless people. We're going to open a branch in the Diocese of Caloocan. I imagine the seminary formator who believed in this man and who accepted him for religious formation in spite of his background. I used to be in the seminary formation team myself. And I know of colleagues back then who would be extra cautious with people with such a background. Some would even go to the extent of saying, once an addict, always an addict. As if conversion or change doesn't really happen. Even people in corporate business rely very much on track record. Well, I have good news for you. Christianity believes in conversion. Saint Barnabas did. And look, what a huge blessing it has brought to the church. It paved the way for a global Christianity.